I'll spend the next 20 minutes approximately to visit with you about a number of subjects. And so this is my list that I like to cover. We'll talk a bit about soybean plant establishment and in particular, our current guidelines based on compilation data relating to plant populations and row spacings. And then I want to talk briefly about plant nutrition, specifically if we have residual nitrogen, phosphorus, or bacteria, what are the implications? And then I'll close, as Hans alluded to talk a bit about cover crops either before the soybean are planted or at the close of the soybean production season. So we'll start with soybean establishment. So I typically show this table in my soybean presentations for a number of reasons. I think it's quite useful, and it certainly will complements the data that Hans has showed with his commercial field survey. So in this chart, this is compilation of trial data regarding 9 factors with soybean establishment. And I want to emphasize that this is a starting point for people in managing their soybeans on their farm, or in particular in their fields. So it's the starting point. You can refine it after starting with, we prefer to have you start with option A. So we're comparing option A to option B because of the yield advantage with option A. And it's based on averages from the trial number that is listed on the right-hand column. I won't discuss each of these, but I'll at least talk about the tillage system and to discuss it. And so what we did is we had 37 trials where we averaged the yield with the reduced till, which included anything from direct seeded to strip till to no till, and then compared the yield to conventional till. And we saw on average a 4% yield increase. And that's across many years and many locations. Okay, some of the other factors, you notice that there's 3 of them that I have labeled in green. And I did that because I want to spend some time a little bit later showing some details on these particular factors. So we'll go down to seed inoculation. I want to point this out because this will be a prelude to a brief discussion I'll have with double inoculation. So you'll notice that with 16 trials, we compared the inoculation of seed where there was a history and see if there was a yield increase versus not inoculating the seed. And so across those 16 trials, we saw a very modest yield advantage of 2%. And so I had this area grayed out because it's not a clear yes to continued inoculation of the seed. In fact, in most of the trials, statistically, we saw no yield increase by inoculating, again, whether it was soybean history versus not. Okay, so a quick look at a summary of lots of trials and lots of data to help a person with establishing soybean. So next, I want to talk about the work we've done with planting rates and row spacings. And so NDSU over the years has always recommended an early season soybean plant stand of 150,000 plants per acre to optimize yield. And this is actually across various row spacings. NDSU has been doing a lot of work even over the last 2 decades and more with either one or both of the factors. And so we did our best to compile data looking at the combination. And so actually, as we explored the database, we used 37 trials that were conducted during this time period and across the state, from Oaks to Williston, to examine the data with a very basic objective of, can we fine tune or be more precise on our planting recommendations and our eventual plant stands? So we did the work, we compiled the data, we analyzed it, and we wrote it up. And so if you're interested in the details with this work, if you simply search the web with the keywords NDSU soybean rates and rows, you'll have the information. But for this morning, I'd like to just summarize the information. And so we did look at the summary of the 2 factors and by regions. But actually, when we looked at East versus Western North Dakota, in both cases, narrow rows outperformed the wide rows. But in the east, when we used narrow rows in our trials, we went down to 12 and 14-inch rows. We found that planting rates of very close to 170,000 plants per acre provided the optimum yield. Now, the database also indicated that when we included wide rows in the trials, we needed to increase the planting rates, which is a bit of a surprise. But we actually found in the database that we needed around 190,000 pure lye seeds per acre to optimize yield. And then in the west, our trials went down to 7 to 10 inches with the narrow rows. And with the narrow rows, we found that the optimum yield was attained with planting rates right around 150,000 pure lye seeds per acre. So that's a very basic summary we found with the work we did. Also keep in mind that these are for optimum yield, but not economic yield. That'll be your homework. You will need to consider the seed costs, of course, as well as the soybean market price. But I'm showing this slide just to apply this because we're talking about planting rates instead of stands. And ultimately, the stand is important. It's up to you to determine what planting rate in order to get to the targeted stand. And so, as I mentioned earlier, with the eastern part of the state, we found to optimize yield, if we had narrow rows, 170,000 pure lye seeds per acre was appropriate. But the rest of the story is, what is the actual stand? And so very typically, we're going to lose some plants, or some plants won't be established even though you're using pure lye seed. But on average, we think 10% is a good estimate on stand loss. And so if that's true, note that we're just a little above 153,000 plants per acre. And this is early season stand counts, which is very close to what our long-term recommendation always has been. In the West, we found narrow rows, 150,000 pure lye seeds per acre. Then at 10% loss in the field, it comes out to be a target of 135,000 plants per acre. So again, these are starting points, and then it's up to you to fine-tune those to fit your farm, your field. And so that means going out and making actual stand counts. That's really important, and just a friendly reminder to do that. And then based on your soil conditions, environment, varieties, a lot of factors involved, you can fine-tune these. But we feel these are really good numbers to start those plans. Okay, move on to the second subject, and that is plant nutrition. I show this circular. We revised this just a couple of years ago, quite a group of us that worked on this. If you want copies of this, simply search the web using the keywords NDSU soil fertility. Dave Franson, our extension soil specialist, will be discussing quite a little of the content in this guide as part of his presentation a little bit later this morning. But there's some specific things that I wanted to talk about. The first is we know that we have higher residual N in the soil. We're very thankful for that based on nitrogen fertilizer supplies and the very high prices. And so people have asked, if I have higher than the normal or expected soil nitrate N levels, how high can we go and still plant soybean? And so our rule of thumb in the past has been, well, 150 pounds per acre would be a guideline. But recently we've thought about it more, and we think it's based really on IDC in the soils. If you have a field history of IDC, then we feel the limit should be in that 50 to 60 pounds of N per acre. And Dave Franson will expound on this, but that's our guideline on maximum N rates. But if IDC is not a concern in your field, then you can really go for whatever N rate you choose. But on a practical basis, certainly if you have rotation options, it would be good to reserve those higher end fields for crops that require higher nitrogen fertilizer rates, such as wheat or corn. The next subject is simply, you noticed on my chart on showing the response of soybean to inoculation when we have a field history was very modest. And so if a person does choose to continue inoculating seed with a previous field history, the question might be, should I double inoculate, which we suggest if with no field history, or just go with one inoculant type. So we explored that with a study that at 2 locations in south central North Dakota and across the years that are shown for a total of 6 site years. So here's our treatments, untreated, singular products, either liquid or granular, and then the double inoculation. Also note that there's some information showing the years separating the soybean trials. They range from 1 to 3 years. And then also information on what was a history on the 4 prior years before the trial was conducted. And it was either 1 or 2 years of soybean in those 4 years before. So by now you probably looked at the yield response. You notice we had some high yielding years and some very low yielding years. But across each trial, statistically no difference in the treatments, untreated all the way up to double inoculation. And the same is true with the 6 site year average, statistically no difference. So our conclusion would be that if you choose to inoculate with a prior soybean history, double inoculation is not necessary. And then a third component of residual is with phosphorus. Very often people ask, if I'm fertilizing for corn and apply phosphorus for the corn, could I also add extra to cover the following year with soybean? And so our recent recommendations have changed in phosphorus application for soybean. Note that we only recommend an application for the short term, for the year of the soybean production, if our soil test levels for phosphorus are low or very low. If it's higher than that, it's unlikely that you'll get a response from applying phosphorus that year. But what if we have low testing soils for phosphorus, but would like to apply the phosphorus the prior year, maybe for corn? And if this was a good strategy, it'd have been wonderful to have the information based on our PE fertilizer supplies and the high prices that we're dealing with. So we did start the work in 2020 at Carrington. We had a low testing soil, 7 parts per million, and very simply, we had 3 treatments. One was untreated check. The middle one was where we applied the phosphorus for the corn in 2020, and then followed up with the phosphorus based on our recommendations from our tables for soybean this past season. And then the third treatment was where we applied sufficient phosphorus for both crops in 2020. And then last year, we planted soybean over this footprint. Unfortunately, because of the drought, we had very low yields in all treatments, averaging only about 18 bushels. So we had no response to the treatments. But we're not giving up. With the support of the Soybean Council, we had funding for both Minot and Carrington to continue the work. And so we started the trials with corn, made the fertilizer application in this past season. Note at Carrington, we had a low testing soil, only 4 parts per million. Again, because of the drought, when we took the corn to yield, we did not statistically see any difference in yield, but we see some promise here with response to the treatments, in particular 2 and 3, when we plant the soybeans in the upcoming season. So stay tuned. We'll be glad to share this information with you when generated. And then my last subject is cover crops. And so I want to talk about some work we've done with using rye planted before the soybean is produced, and then also looking at some cover crop response to in-season applied herbicides in soybean. So we're doing this work to reduce soil erosion as one of the featured goals. So I can't imagine anyone on our meeting today likes to see a picture like this. And so we think cover crops is a very nice answer to reducing or eliminating soil erosion. Okay, so how about planting winter rye before soybean? NDSU currently recommends a wide range of planting rates, anywhere from 20 to 90 pounds per acre, and also a planting window in the fall, anywhere from August until into November. And so it's very hard to give a precise recommendation to people call and ask about rates and dates. So that's what we're after. We started this trial in 2019 with planting the rye at 2 dates and then 3 rates. And then we wanted to measure what happens with the rye plant stand on ground cover, weed suppression, and then ultimately the impact on soybean. So this is a 3-year average looking at the winter rye stand. And I show this to point out the dates that were used. The first year we started quite late in October and then follow with late October. We did this on purpose. And then more recently, we've been a little more timely on our planting in September and then followed with a late planting time. And then also notice the planting rates, 25, 50, and 75 pounds per acre. So with this 3-year average, we had modest stands of the rye when we measured it in May before we planted the soybean. And so at these modest stands at a little over 600,000 plants per acre or 15 plants per square foot, we had actually minimal ground cover, even with planting earlier and with a high rate. Conservation tillage can be defined as having a ground cover of a minimum of 30%. So we just met the minimum. Well, how about in years in the trial when we had some higher rye stands? And we did achieve that in 2020. Note that planting earlier and with 50 or 75 pounds, we had stands of rye around 800,000 to over 1 million plants per acre. And that certainly helped increase our ground cover and get it to levels that we'd like to help reduce soil erosion and some other benefits of the cover crop. And so 60% is much better than the 30 or less that I showed you in the previous slide. And then how about weed suppression? That same year where we had the nice stands of rye, that certainly helped us with at least suppressing weeds such as foxtail or kochia. With the kochia, when we got to about 800,000 plants per acre, then we got to the level that we had substantial suppression of the kochia. And then if we got at 1 million or above, well, then we saw some adequate suppression of both of these weeds. Notice when our rye levels were much less, we had essentially no impact, a very minimal impact on the weeds. And then what was the soybean response? We found when we looked at the soybean plant development that and also canopy closure, that they were similar among treatments. And then this table shows a 3-year average of the actual soybean plant density and as well as seed yield. And so ultimately, as long as we manage the rye correctly, kill it at a good time where we're not sacrificing any topsoil for adequate establishment of the soybean, that we can have a very nice stand and ultimately very nice yields. So it didn't matter what we did on planting dates of the rye or rates, we were able with good management to achieve good soybean stands and yield. And so we've included some of the information from this study, which continues, we're continuing into 2022, but we're including the information in this brand new guide on growing rye as a cover crop. This applies to soybean as well as other crops. And so if you'd like a copy of this, simply search the web with the keywords NDSU rye cover crop. And then finally, I want to mention if a person plans to plant a cover crop late in the season with soybeans, say at leaf drop at R7 or beyond, or maybe some years we even have the opportunity to plant after the crop has been harvested. Say maybe the first half of September, that would give us possibly the opportunity to plant some cover crop based on the goals that we have. And so we're exploring that. We explored that because we want to make sure that a person is successful in establishing the fall cover crop. And we are concerned about herbicides that have residual that were used in the soybean crop that may be a detriment to the cover crops. And so very simply, this is a chart that we compiled with the work that we did at Fargo and Carrington over the years shown, and we ended up with 6 site years of data. And you can see some of the common herbicides used in soybean that were in this study, as well as some of the common cover crops that a person typically would use. And so very simply, we found those crops, those cover crops that are most susceptible to our common soybean herbicides would be radish, turnip, and rapeseed or canola. So I don't want to get into any details on this. I'll just point out that in our current weed control guide, the 2022 guide on page 106 is this table and some further information. So to summarize, I think you got the story on the planting dates and rates study. Keep in mind we're still working on it, but I think our information will be correct as is shown here. And then for considering establishing cover crops after soybeans have grown and considering herbicides that were used that have residual, our best bets on crops to grow with low risk would be barley, winter rye, and field pea, and then flax might be a possibility as well.